So if anybody has got questions to ask that they don't particularly want recorded, I'll put my email address up at the end, and people can always comment or send questions in that way. But we're going to have a Q&A session after this, my opening talk, which we will capture and share afterwards as well. Because hopefully that will be interesting, and I'd like it to be an interactive Q&A session. Just in terms of what I'm going to cover over the 2 hours of this workshop, you'll be glad to hear I'm not going to speak for the full 2 hours. I'm going to give a talk to begin with, some early examples of nuclear communication, how the industry has communicated, not always very well. Talk about how things have improved, hopefully, or how things have changed and hopefully improved over the years. And then I'll talk about a bit of a model that I have for communication and how that can be effective. Hopefully that is helpful to some of you in terms of your future engagement, whoever that might be with. We'll look at a few principles of good communication and examples of good practice. And then from about 1 o'clock onwards, so for about the second half of the session, there will be a couple of exercises. The first one is a crisis comms exercise. We'll split the people who are here in the room into a couple of groups. We'll also, through the miracle of technology, put those of you who are online into breakout groups for that. We'll run that exercise, we'll get some feedback, and then there was a second exercise, which hopefully we'll have time for at the end. If there's any comments or queries or issues, either stick your hand up in the room or put a comment in the chat, and colleagues who are monitoring the chat will be able to pick that up and hopefully deal with it. In the absence of any hands up or messages to the contrary, I'll just carry on. Now, I'm going to start by looking at how, even before there was a civil nuclear industry, how the sector, the embryonic sector, and the government and others talked about radiation, and a couple of really early examples going back to nuclear medicine and the use of radioactivity to impact on health. And I'm sharing these just because they always amuse me. I think they would raise an eyebrow at least if we were to see things like this today. This one comes from the early 20th century. It's an advertisement for radium therapy. So it's radioactive material to allegedly improve public health. It talks about the apparatus giving a high and measured dosage of radioactive drinking water for the treatment of various ailments. And it says radioactivity prevents insanity, rouses noble emotions, not quite sure whether we want to go down that particular avenue, retards old age, and creates a splendid, youthful, joyous life. Well, why don't we all irradiate ourselves as much as possible? As somebody who's worked, as Will said, 40 years in the industry, I'm fairly sure that exposure to the nuclear industry doesn't retard old age. Whether radiation does or not is another question. And if anybody has ever visited an Indian restaurant chain called Dishoom, and if you've ever been in their male restrooms, I can't comment on the female restrooms, but there's an advert that I've seen in a couple of their branches that is headed "The Golden Key to Wedlock Bliss." And again, this talks about using, as it says, the physiological principle of stimulating the solar plexus through a radioactive substance. Again, I'm not going to go down the potential side avenue of what the implications of that might be. I also have to be very careful taking my telephone out in a gent's toilet. But it's another great example of how 100 years or so ago, society talked about radiation as something that was universally good and positive and was going to have a beneficial impact on public health, rather than as something that we might want to steer away from unless it was unavoidable. So the early years of conversations around nuclear becoming a little more serious were all around the use of radioisotopes for nuclear medicine. Another example here from the 30s and 40s about providing physicians with tools and diagnosis and therapy. In this case, we've moved on to specifically looking at cancer therapy, which is something we still see radioactivity and radioisotopes used for today, and will continue to in the future. But as it says on the slide, even though over these decades, particularly through the 40s, as the atomic bomb was becoming the focus of people's anxiety, the use of radioisotopes for public good, for improving public health, and efforts to harness the splitting of the atom for peaceful purposes was very prevalent, whether that was advancing medicine, whether it was about energy, or the impact that access to nuclear weapons and nuclear material had on geopolitics. One of my favorite props, I've collected various bits of nuclear industry memorabilia over the years. And one of my favorite props, again, to illustrate how things have changed, is a textbook first printed in 1949. It's entitled Atomic Power. It's from the days before anybody had ever built a power station, and it's a textbook explaining how basically we could harness the energy from splitting the atom and generate electricity from that. Those who have heard me speak before or may have seen the book before, but does anybody either online or in the room want to hazard a guess as to what the imagery might be on the front of this textbook? Somebody, was that a guess online, or was your guess? Sorry, right? A bomb. Yeah, basically, it was a mushroom cloud. I've got the book here for those in the room. You're welcome to have a look at it afterwards. It's not an anti-nuclear book. It's not a sort of Greenpeace type publication or anything else. It's a textbook on making electricity by splitting the atom. And it puts a mushroom cloud on the front of it. Now, remember, this was 1949. This is just 4 years after the end of the Second World War, at a time when the use of atomic weapons was used to hasten the end of the Second World War. So that mushroom cloud was a very positive image in people's minds. It symbolized a major step in bringing peace to the world. But you would never see that kind of symbolism in a nuclear debate now, other than firmly in the anti-nuclear camp. I would say if you ever go to the Sellafield story, the public exhibition of the history of Sellafield, the site in West Cumbria, it's in the Beacon Museum in Whitehaven. The very first thing you see there as they tell the history of the site is also a mushroom cloud, because they're honest enough to recognize that that was the starting point of the civil nuclear industry, as well as the history of nuclear weapons, and that they have the same origin, but have taken very different pathways since then. So moving on to the days when we actually had a civil nuclear industry, the 50s and the 60s. The photo shows the late Majesty the Queen opening Calder Hall in 1956. And at that time, government and the leading scientists were the decision makers. It was a very technocratic, autocratic society. Scientists were held in extremely high regard, and a time when, as we were doing things like approaching the space race as well, putting satellites and eventually individuals into space, the use of new technology that hadn't been around 10 or 20 years ago was always seen as a pathway to a bright new future. So progress was really fast. If you want to have a look at the timescales for building Calder Hall at a time when there was no supply chain, no knowledge of prior building of nuclear reactors, none of the internet technology that we have today, it's incredible how quickly Calder Hall was designed and built compared to the timescales we see today. And public support for nuclear was incredibly high. It was seen as a symbol of national pride that we would have a nuclear industry, and that in the UK we were the first to deploy it for the production of electricity. But I put a quote in here from a 1955 government white paper, so it's a year before Calder Hall was opened. And to me, this symbolizes a very common feature of the way the industry and government have communicated about nuclear over the years, because it's riven with contradiction. I'm going to read it out in full. It says, the reactors that will be built for the commercial production of electricity will present no more danger to people living nearby than many existing industrial works sited within built-up areas. So far, so good. Nevertheless, the first stations, even though they will be of inherently safe design, will not be built in heavily built-up areas. So with one sentence, the government is saying these are perfectly safe and they're just as safe as the steelworks or the cement factory or anything else you've got next door. And in the second sentence, they're saying, but we're not going to put these where we've got a lot of people. So immediately, if you hear that, you will think, well, why do the government actually believe what they're saying themselves if they're taking a decision to put them in remote areas, having said that they're as safe as anything we might have in towns and cities? And we see a lot of that over the history of the industry and its existence. I'm going to show a little video now, which dates from 1957. It's a video in the aftermath of the Windscale Fire. And this is actually a Pathé News film clip. So for anyone younger than me, this dates back to a time when households didn't have televisions very often. People got their news at the cinema. They would go and see a film at the cinema, and before the film, you would get little snippets of news items. So this would be the only bit of information that the public, the audience, would have got about the story that it's telling. And hopefully, I will play the video. We'll turn off my voice.
Emergency at Windscale atom plant, and the milk from 200 square miles of farmland is condemned as radioactive. But for these filter tops, once nicknamed Cockcroft's Folly because Sir John Cockcroft insisted on them, farms much farther away would have faced not emergency but disaster. Now the worst seems to be over, though Mr. Stan Ritson, who helped to bring Windscale's overheated reactor under control, was radioactive for 4 days and couldn't even kiss his wife till the Geiger counters gave permission. The farmers carry on as usual, for cows have to be milked, whatever happens to the milk afterwards. You can't explain radioactivity to a cow. Milk Marketing Board lorries collect the contaminated milk. The trouble arose when radioactive dust from the overheated pile fell on the Cumberland pastures, and milk samples rushed to Harwell were found to contain 6 times as much radioactive iodine as international health standards permit. So for the time being, down the drain it goes. Meanwhile, emergency supplies from outside are delivered to more than 5,000 people who normally get their milk from the banned farms. Experts believe the danger is already past, but until they're quite sure, the ban stays. With atoms, you can't be too careful.
So just remember that with atoms, you can't be too careful. If you ever encounter any atoms during the rest of the day, just be really, really careful about it. Before I talk about the next slide, some of the things that struck me about that film clip, remember that's the only information people would get about that story. It talks about the reactor overheating. It talks about the emergency at the atom plant. It talks about milk being 6 times as radioactive as safe levels allow. But the main focus is on what people are going to put on their cornflakes in the morning, rather than how did it happen? What's the impact on the local community? Is it safe to go out? Could it happen somewhere else? All of the things that are not said in that clip really symbolize how the industry was just talking about how good we are at putting measures in place to deal with a little bit of a problem that we've happened to have up in West Cumbria. You can't imagine heaven forbid that we have a similar event today. The last thing the news would focus on is how are the local population going to get their breakfast in the morning, or whether Stan Ritson can kiss his wife before the Geiger counters say it's okay. It would all be about the technology of the reactor, the explosion, the risk to public health, the release of material, and huge concern about whether it could happen anywhere else. But it symbolizes what the view was of nuclear of the day, that we will overlook these little glitches and almost make a comedy film about you can't explain radioactivity to a cow. That was back in the 50s. As we move through latter decades and we get into, in this instance, as I put on this slide, the 70s and 80s, we see the industry being perceived in a very different way. Windscale, which I should have said is the former name for the Sellafield site, branded as Britain's biggest nuclear disaster in newspaper clips and in TV shows. There was a Britain's nuclear dustbin World in Action program about how Cumbria was basically taking the rest of the world's nuclear waste, and we were going to keep it here in the UK and never send anything back. There's stories around Sellafield of clusters of childhood leukemias, which were alleged to have linked back to that Windscale fire. So not picked up at the time, but picked up 20, 30 years later in the news stories because of public health concerns. On the bottom right, a story about plutonium from Sellafield being in the teeth of every child in England. And also there's a picture there of a public notice when the local beach had to be closed because radioactive particles had been found on St. Bees Beach. The piece on the left, headlined Sellafield and the Suffering Children, shows again a family who claimed that their child had been impacted by the radiation release of the Windscale fire, and what I think today we would call, in the world of social media, showing their best compo face on the photograph of a suffering family. But very much a different flavour and a different emphasis around the way in which nuclear was seen and talked about. And in fact, the site at Sellafield changed its name to Sellafield from Windscale during this period in the 1980s, partly to get rid of or it was claimed at least, to get rid of the baggage that was associated with the word Windscale. Looking back with hindsight, there's at least as much baggage now associated with the name Sellafield as there was with Windscale. And as the UK developed its industry through that period, we built the advanced gas-cooled reactors. We built more reprocessing facilities, like the beginning of Thorpe at Sellafield. in spite of a significant amount of public concern in all sorts of areas: waste disposal, transport of materials, the connection between the civil nuclear industry and nuclear weapons, and two big international incidents: 3 Mile Island in 1979 in the US and Chernobyl in what is now Ukraine in 1986. Despite all of that, the industry continued to build its programs, and the approach was still the same. The decision makers were government and leading scientists still, and the policy that people approached was one that was called, with hindsight, was branded as DAD: decide, announce, defend. So the government would decide what they wanted to do, they would tell people what they were going to do, and then they would be criticized for it, and they would be defending their position against all of the different aspects of concern that people had. And against that backdrop, public support for nuclear declined very, very significantly through this period. It was no longer seen as the bright hope and the industry to rush into and work in. It was almost a last resort sector for people to join. I'm going to show another two videos now, one of which is a real TV advert for a breakfast cereal called Ready Brek. And the second one is a spoof on that was in a TV show called Not the 9 O'Clock News. Both date from the early 80s, 1982. So if I stop speaking.
Ready Brek with lashings of hot milk to soak up those natural oats, malt and vitamins. All goodness and nothing wasted.
This is the way to start the day on a cold and frosty morning. This is the way to glow to school, glow to school, glow to school. This is the way to glow to school, a cold and frosty morning. This is the way to glow to school on a cold and frosty morning.
Ready Brek, central heating for kids.
Do you want your kids to glow in the dark? Then move to Windscale.
Sorry, thank you. I didn't put those two clips in specifically for the comedy value, but just to illustrate how taking that kind of comedy pot shot at the nuclear industry was pretty common and pretty fair game at the time, and that was the kind of reputation that the industry had, that it was going to cause people to be radioactive. That when I don't know about some of you in the room or some of you online, but when you talk about working in nuclear, people still say, do you glow in the dark, or have you got 3 heads, or this kind of stereotype that goes back to some of the relic of that time. But looking more at how the industry through the 80s and 90s took some more positive steps to try to build public support, and it has been a long process. Public engagement started to be a bit more active. It was more of a thing that the industry did. At the time, it wasn't particularly engaging. It was more about providing information, but at least they did start to try and have some engagement with the public. But it was a time when a lot of plans for things that were proposed by the industry didn't go ahead, whether that was reactors, whether it was geological disposal facilities, and some of you will be aware we're still on that journey today, trying to find a geological disposal facility that will have community support. Some of those things were started back then in the 80s and 90s. And that approach of decide, announce, defend has now become decide, announce, defend, and then abandon. So DAD has become DADA. And that started to really stimulate the industry into thinking we need to do something. We can't just carry on with this approach because it's getting in the way of our operations. We can't build the facilities that we need. We can't have the public support that we want. We can't recruit the people that we need into the industry. As it says, public support at that time was low. So since 2000, we've seen a more engaging approach to nuclear, engaging with communities, with the public, the media, and others. There's a raised awareness that's linked to a lot of things that are in the public consciousness, particularly over the last 10, 20 years around the need to reduce CO2. There's been a more transparency of information. So the advent of internet technology and much more comprehensive websites has allowed companies and organizations to share a lot more information than was previously the case. even things like the licensing of reactors has been exposed to public scrutiny, and all the technical information that is available to regulators is also shared with the public, and there's a public comments process around that. The public get to ask their questions, they get to have them answered, and the scrutiny as well of the engagement process itself to find out whether it's working and whether people really are engaging with it. And it's symbolic that I think the industry has looked to work more closely with the public and other identified stakeholder groups to try and understand people's concerns and be open and honest about challenges. And it's not always easy to be honest, because the first part of that is often acknowledging some of the failings of the past. And now that decision-making process involves government, industry, but also a significant amount of public consultation. This isn't just around nuclear, you see it around transport and other infrastructure and public policy decisions as well. But public consultation is much more baked into the process. It's much more about engage, deliberate, and decide than the decision being the first part and then the justification coming afterwards. And as a result, since 2000 or thereabouts, we've seen increasing public support for nuclear. I've not included the stats in here, but it's typically a third. When you ask people in general in the street, it's about a third are supportive, a third are opposed, and a third are ambivalent, don't know, don't care, which is not a bad place to be and is similar to many other potentially contentious issues. So you can ask the question, what's your nuclear? Is it this? Is it the sunny views of Sellafield? Is it Sizewell B? I get set against a blue sky and the Queen opening Calder Hall at a time of national pride? Or is it more nuclear waste buried under people's homes? Is it nuclear power, no thanks? The barbed wire, the triple fences, the security systems around sites like Sellafield, and the protests about the industry and what it is? Or in many cases, if we're going out again and stopping people in the street outside, could very easily be this. A lot of people's only real engagement and perception of what goes on in the nuclear industry is through the cartoon depiction of The Simpsons. And I once showed a group of local politicians around when I worked for Westinghouse, the nuclear fuel factory on the Springfield site in Preston. And one of them, to his credit, at the end said, I've driven past the site loads of times. I've seen the building from the main road. And in my mind, I've always assumed that people inside were ankle deep in some green goo. He said, and I've come round it, and what I've seen is a modern state-of-the-art manufacturing plant, similar to a motor manufacturing plant, for instance. He said, my head is completely blown. And to his credit, he was a local potential aspiring politician, you would say should have known better, but had the honesty to say he didn't. And that's made me think, how much more have we got to go and do to convince other people that inside all of our nuclear facilities doesn't really look like this? So I'm going to say a little bit now on a kind of model that I have for communication and how that works. And it's a very simple model. I've kind of adapted it from a couple of things I've seen from other people. It's really only 5 words. It's about message, it's about voice, channel, audience, and outcome. The first part is the bit that we always think about and focus on, is the message. What are we actually going to say? The voice piece is really, how are we saying it? So, for instance, is it coming from an individual? Is it coming from me, Adrian Bull? Is it coming from the organization that I work for? Is it something branded as the Dalton Nuclear Institute or the University of Manchester or a broader nuclear industry thing? Or is it, in many cases, you'll see things that are almost unbranded? What's the channel? How are we reaching people with that message? So is it face-to-face conversation? Is it website? Is it social media? Is it a poster on the side of a bus stop? And the last 2 are the bits that quite often organizations forget about. Their drive is to get the message out there. But the last 2 are probably the most important. Who's the audience or the intended audience? And the last is, what is the outcome or the desired outcome from doing that communication? And that's almost where to start. Or with the last 2 is where to start. So, the public isn't like this. We're not all the same. You only need to look around this room or step outside into the street, and you see not only do we not look the same, we look different. But even just by looking at people in a group of people, you can't tell what people's views might be. Are they enthusiastically learning about new technology or new issues that are cropping up? Are they confident in doing that? Are they disengaged? Are they skeptical? Are they distrustful for whatever reason? Do they have a concern that you may or may not know about? And if we're honest, we might all be different things on different days. On one day of the week when I'm doing one thing, I might be more positive about something. If I've read something over the weekend or with a different group of people, I might find I'm taking on a slightly different persona. So even trying to identify where people sit is not always a once and for all activity. but recognizing that not just that diversity of background, but the diversity of thinking is, I know it's obvious, but is really important, and the industry hasn't always done that. So a little bit of audience participation. We're going to think a little bit about audiences and stakeholders. For those of you online, please pop your answers or your thoughts in the chat. For those in the room, just have a think about who are some of the different audiences or stakeholders that we might have in the nuclear industry. I'm not going to capture them, but let's just shout them out or type them in the chat for a few seconds. Thoughts? Some of our different audiences? Funders, yeah, people who are investors or potential investors. Government is a very broad one, but government in general, it can be MPs, it can be civil servants.
We've got supply chain, existing and potential, and local site populations.
Yeah, supply chain is one, and the local population is a really important one. That can again be almost subdivided, but that's really important.
Employees and researchers.
I'm glad somebody said employees. We always forget our own colleagues as being an audience, and they're really important because they're potential ambassadors for everything that we do. So yeah, colleagues, employees of the industry, or people working with the industry, or looking at the industry and researching the industry. Any others come online?
Insurance, national health system.
Oh yeah, insurers and national health. There's probably a couple that I haven't got here. Let me show you my list, and there's no wrong answers for this, but this list has grown while I've been doing variations of this talk over the years. So yeah, politicians and government officials, and you can mention government employees, potential employees as well. Quite often we're talking to people who might want to come and join the industry or think about researching. Unions, media, supply chain, the industry itself, the broader energy sector, community groups, and that can be things like local councils or pressure groups, as well as local citizens, research partners, bodies like the NDA, who have almost a unique role, regulators, colleges and schools, NGOs, and the environmental groups. Those environmental groups can be anti-nuclear or they can be pro-environment, and there's some overlap between the two. We're seeing the emergence of sort of pro-nuclear NGOs now. Industry bodies like the CBI, and then there is the wider public. And these, of course, overlap. Anybody who is one of any of the first is also, in their own right, member of the general public as well. They've got family and kids and next door neighbours who they also think about and their thoughts. So lots and lots of audiences. We could segment those down even further if we wanted to. Having thought about the audience, question then is, what's the outcome you want to achieve? Are you looking to just inform them about something? At a very simple level, you might have a communication within the university that is just telling people there's going to be an IT outage at 5 o'clock. It's just information. You don't need people to do anything other than know that. We're trying to reassure them about something. We're trying to impress them with how much we know. By we, I mean the industry and those who work with it. We're actually trying to change people's views to get them to think differently from the way we think they thought before, in which case do we really know what they thought before and how we might change that view? Do we want them to go and do something, take some action, sign up to something maybe, or do we want to stop them doing something, signing up to somebody else's petition? Maybe we even want to make them an advocate for either the industry or for a particular project. So in my kind of bottom line of my communication model is to make sure the messages, the voice and the channel support both the intended outcome and the audience that is being reached or targeted. When we look at topics for messaging, I was going to make this a bit of audience participation as well, but again, it can take a long time. But there's all sorts of different things we talk about. Different potential audiences will be interested in different aspects of the overall message that can go around nuclear. Things like safety and security are obvious ones, the carbon emission reduction and the wider environmental impact, but quite often people are concerned about things like impact on the wider region. In conversations around potential geological disposal at the moment, people are concerned about what that will do to the reputation and the impression that people have of a particular part of the country, whether that's somewhere that has had nuclear before or not. Okay, hopefully I'm back, and let me put it on proper screen share. Apologies for that slight glitch. Absolutely. Right. And I'm unmuted, and hopefully we're back on. So apologies again for that. I'm just going to look at a few principles and a bit of the background to some good examples of nuclear industry communication. This actually originates partly at the University of Manchester. It's some work done by the Nuclear Industry Council a long time ago now, 2014, but the principles are still there. It was run by Andrew Sherry when he was here at Manchester. He was the lead of the subgroup that produced this report in the public eye. And I think he actually joined a national nuclear lab while it was in production. 4 key characteristics of successful engagement: clarity, which is obviously the use of clear language; trust, building up that trust with your audiences and thinking about that right at the outset, because if the people who are in the room here or dialed in online don't actually trust me and believe what I say, it's completely irrelevant what I might be saying to you, no matter how impressive looking my slides or my graphs or my words or anything else might be. If you don't trust me, it means nothing. And we've seen some examples of that with kind of misinformation in public life in the last few years. Dialogue is really about having a two-way conversation and listening before speaking. And the bit about consultation is, where possible, allowing those stakeholders, particularly with the example of like local communities, to have a say themselves in the thing that will be coming to their area. So public engagement is particularly important in that sphere, in dealing with local communities, and letting them both being clear what's not up for discussion, but also what they can influence and how they can influence it, how to go about that, really important. I'll crack on quickly because I do want to leave some time for questions, but some of my key principles: make sure the communication is based on the right context, that people know why they're having that conversation in the first place. If we were to stop people in the street and ask them their views on nuclear, they would give us some answers, but they might also walk off slightly bemused about why they've just been stopped in the centre of Manchester by somebody asking them what they think about nuclear energy, and they might go home slightly concerned and worried about that. And we've seen examples before where people with good intention have gone into a local community to ask them a load of stuff, and word gets around really quickly, and it creates a lot of mistrust and fear in a community that's almost literally been picked as a completely random community. And that takes a bit of unraveling sometimes. So make sure that communication is written in clear language, that it's concise, that it's accurate, as relevant and human as possible. So the question, what does it mean to me, is one to ask ourselves as communicators before we start going out and communicating. It's very easy to tell people what you're concerned about rather than ask them what they're concerned about. And I'll share a very quick example. When I worked for Westinghouse, we ran the Springfield site up in Preston, as I mentioned, the fuel factory. And because it was an NDA site, we had to go and do a public community consultation every 5 or 10 years. I forget exactly what it was. We had to go out and ask a series of standard questions. Are you positive, neutral, negative, very negative, or about the operations of the site? Do you strongly support, etc., the continuation of operations? So they were mostly standard questions with 5 blobs to pick from, 5 options to pick from, in order to pick trends up and gather the data. But there was also a free text box at the end where people could raise any concerns that they had. And we, as management, thought we knew the things that they would ask about. It would be about radioactive discharges to the River Ribble through the estuary. It would be about releases that people sometimes saw a slightly browny tinge of plume coming up one of the chimneys, and we knew that local communities were concerned about that. It might be about the jobs potential on the site for decades to come. None of that was top of the list of what people asked about. The thing, or raised concerns about, the thing that was by far was the most popular concern, or the most frequent concern that people raised, was the speed that our colleagues drove through their villages in the morning, coming to work and leaving work in the afternoon, because that coincided with the time local residents were setting off on their work journeys to work, but more importantly, the time that kids were going out to school. So we've got however many hundreds or thousand people arriving at the site for 8:30 and leaving at 4 o'clock. And the biggest impact on the local community was all these cars speeding through narrow country lanes and local streets. It wasn't on our radar at all. We were just thinking of our employees from the minute they got on the site, and when they, we stopped thinking about them in blunt terms when they left again in the afternoon. But once we got that feedback, we were able to share some of that concern with our colleagues, and it highlight the importance of their actions on helping to keep the site's reputation as a good neighbour. And then being as clear as possible on the action that we're looking for from people or not. And I've got an example here. It's an example from Sri Lanka. Will mentioned I was on an IAEA to think about communicating with local communities about, they don't have a nuclear in Sri Lanka, but they're planning it. And they proudly showed us this booklet they produced. On the screen, you can see the front cover. I've got the real one in my hand for those in the room. It's about 40 pages long. And basically inside follows the example of what you've got on the front cover. There's lots of cutaways of reactor designs. There's tables of data. There's graphs, there's charts, there's decay curves of radioactive elements. There's histograms. There isn't a single human face in this 40-page brochure. And they were very proud of it. And they said to us, it's written in the local Sri Lankan language, which is absolutely the right thing to do. And a huge amount of work had gone into it. And we said, well, that's great. Is that for like your supply chain? And is it for people who are like studying in universities looking to join the industry? No, that's for everybody. Well, that's for your local community groups and your residents. Yes, yes, yes. They were very proud that everything was in here, but it's pretty impenetrable. And most people would, I think, like to see some human faces and some impact on what might nuclear mean for them. Obviously, it couldn't come from Sri Lanka, but from other countries that have got nuclear. How do local communities feel about it? Good as far as it went, but almost negative because of what it didn't say rather than helpful for what it did. So my kind of key principles: listen before speaking. That Westinghouse example is a good one of listening to what people's concerns are before we tell them all the stuff about how safe we are, for instance. Putting ourselves in the audience shoes, being clear where we agree and where we don't. If it's a dialogue, a conversation where there might be some disagreement, being respectful, understanding why people might be concerned. And we shouldn't have to make other people work hard to reassure themselves about the things that we in the nuclear industry do. It's no good saying, well, let me explain to you how a reactor works so that you can be reassured about what it means. We should find ways to explain and reassure to people. I always use the example of mobile phones. I'm old enough to remember when these first came out, and there was concern that by holding it to your ear, you were going to, the microwaves or whatever from the mobile phone was going to fry people's brains. I didn't need to understand the physics of how a mobile phone works or become a medical specialist to learn how radiation was going to impact on my brain. I just needed somebody to point out the benefits and somebody I trusted to tell me it was okay. And I think in the industry, we start from a slightly different position sometimes of explaining radioactivity and reactor physics to people to try and reassure them about what they have or might have in their communities. And the final point, which is really important in any kind of communication, particularly dialogues, is never to be afraid to say you don't know. And respecting, as I mentioned, respecting people's concerns. I've just put on the slide here some genuine reasons why people might be concerned about radiation or about nuclear. And we can't argue with any of the things in these speech bubbles. It is complicated technology. We know that when things go wrong, they can go very badly wrong. I won't go through all of them, but these are all, I believe, factually based statements that could cause people to have concern. So the worst sometimes the industry can do is to say to people, you shouldn't worry, you mustn't worry, don't worry about stuff, because people do worry. It's understandable to worry. When you're in a plane at 36,000 feet, it's no good saying, don't worry, here's a chart, an aerodynamic chart of how the pressure flow changes over a wing, for instance. You want to be reassured, but it's legitimate. You have to recognize people are worried by that kind of situation. And some of the characteristics of the nuclear industry inspire concern and worry and anxiety amongst people as well. I'm going to very quickly just skip through the next couple. Just explaining data in a helpful, meaningful way sometimes is important as well. I've just picked an example of how we talk about Britain's nuclear waste legacy. This is the pie chart by volume of different types of waste. And it shows, as you would expect, there's a lot more low level and very low level waste than we have high level. But I find the next way of showing it much more informative. It's got the volumes on the right and the amount of radioactivity on the left. So you can see for high level waste, it's got almost all, that 80–90% of the radioactivity is in the high level waste, hardly any of the volume. Low level and very low level the other way around. Vast majority of the volume, but only a tiny fraction of the radioactivity. Maybe the one people ought to be concerned about is intermediate level, where there's quite a lot of it and it's quite nasty stuff. So just looking at data in different ways and making that engaging and helpful for people can be helpful for them to understand the nature of what it is that they're thinking about. And the very last thing I wanted to talk about by way of example is just it's a facility in the Netherlands. It's not an ultimate waste disposal facility, but it's a waste storage facility called the Cobra Haybog facility. As you can see, because it's in the Netherlands, they painted it orange, their national colour. I won't go through what it stands for. It's not only is it a striking orange building, but it's also one of the largest works of art in the Netherlands. They got an artist involved to create the look and feel of this building. It's called Metamorphosis, so it symbolises the change that goes on within it. But the key thing is they repaint that orange exterior every 20 years. And that repainting symbolises the radioactive decay of the waste that's stored inside. So when it was first built, top left, it was bright orange in 2003. They're due to repaint it next year in a lighter shade of orange. And by the time we get to the middle of the century, it'll be a kind of dirty, faded beige colour almost. I don't know whether they actually repaint it or if they just rely on nature to do this and don't repaint it back the orange that it was meant to be. You can imagine that being a natural progression of the paint over excuse me, over 100 years. But the symbolism of that is a great way of explaining and sharing with the local community what's actually going on inside without them having access to it. But the Dutch actually go one better than that. They encourage the public to go into this building. They have a great saying, they understand the art of preservation, but they also preserve art. So because they have a carefully controlled environment in this building, they use it to preserve artworks. They have paintings stored there and displayed there. They have scientific displays there. And it's a public space. They have concerts there, they have exhibitions there, they can encourage people to go in and enjoy the space. How different is that from the way in which we in this country treat our nuclear facilities, or putting big barbed wire fences around them and telling people they can't come in? Why not make it a part of the community and have the barrier between the public and the radioactive material within the building? Now, my other half despairs of me that as we drive around the country and be pointing out nuclear power stations on the coast or some kind of nuclear facility, that wouldn't it be great to go and have a drive round? But genuinely, if we were in Holland, and hopefully we will be before too long, I think I could persuade her to go and spend half a day at this place and have a look around it, because it is a tourist attraction. They've encouraged the public in rather than keeping the public out. And that seems like a great way of building that trust and that relationship. So I'm going to stop there. Apologies for the technical glitch in the middle. And I'm going to ask for any comments, questions, discussion. We've got about 15 minutes or so for this, if people have got comments and questions, and hopefully people are still online and can hear. So I'm going to mute myself on here now. We're going to plug the owl in so that people who are online can.
Can people online hear me? Try now.
Is that going to be actually? Let me How's that? Can people hear me okay now? Right, okay. Too much technology. Yeah, I mean, Ju and that's a great observation. Sue Ian, who many of you will know, Dame Sue Ian, who's one of the leading lights of the nuclear industry and has been throughout my career, also has said a number of times she won a school science competition, and her prize was a textbook on nuclear energy, and that was what got her into the industry as one of the most influential and successful people in the sector has had in the last several decades. So it does demonstrate good communication can have massively impactful sort of consequences, and we've seen it with both Juan's personal example and Sue's as well.
So there's three more. One is, do you think the many false starts in new build over the recent years will have a negative impact on public support, and if so, how can we address it?
That's a great question. I think they can only have a negative impact, hopefully not too negative, because the industry has been there every time we've had plans for new nuclear saying, yes, we are going to do X. And people have responded and got ready for that in one way or another, and then it's not happened. So it's a bit like crying wolf. I used to work for Westinghouse, and I know that there were supply chain companies who were skilling up to deliver the AP1000 reactor that we were trying to sell into the UK 10, 15 years ago, because we told them and developers had said that they wanted to build it and were keen to build it. And the fact it didn't quite happen will have had a negative impact. They've spent money, people have taken career decisions based on doing that. We've seen, perhaps more extreme examples with projects like Moorside and the Horizon project at Wilfer, where whole organizations have been set up to deliver reactors. People have relocated their families to take positions in either those companies or the companies that are going to be involved in delivering it, and then it's not happened. So there comes a point where people stop believing what they have heard somebody tell them is probably going to happen, and will wait for it to definitely happen, or else they'll take a decision to move outside. I think the industry's reputation is never served well if we don't, or the industry doesn't do what it said it was going to do, or if it does it late, or if it does it in a different way, or if it's massively over budget. So can't help.
The next question was, how do we understand the rapid recovery of UK confidence after Fukushima, but it didn't in many European countries?
That's a really good question as well. I think our politicians were brave and understood actually what people were concerned about. If you remember, it was a time when cutting carbon emissions was rightly at the centre of a lot of policy making. It was a time when we had the Conservative Lib Dem coalition, and it would have been easy for some of those policymakers, particularly some of the Lib Dems who were, their party is historically sceptical about nuclear, and they were in positions of control in both the business and the energy departments. They could have taken a more negative view. But actually, I think they understood and were well briefed that public support was at least balanced about nuclear. And there was a huge debate that went on about nuclear, probably more so in the UK, more open and transparent and engaging in some of the UK media than some of the other countries in the world. And that, I think, helped the public support for the industry by 12 months after Fukushima had rebounded to what it was like before Fukushima. It took a dip in the summer and it was back again by Christmas at the levels that had been before. So if there hadn't been any polling done in the June, if it was just the annual sort of Christmas time polling that the industry does, you wouldn't see a Fukushima effect at all. So I can only think it's because we had good scientists and good spokespeople, both from within the industry and outside. And again, people from the university sector, Andrew Sherry, Jerry Thomas, Robin Grimes, Lawrence Williams, many other, Malcolm Grimston, many other academics who knew a lot about nuclear were on the media talking in ways that the public could understand and having what you would call a grown-up and a transparent debate. And I think people recognised the real benefits. Good question.
Yeah, very good. The next one, what are your thoughts on media outlets that refer to VDF as a waste?
That's a great question as well. It's the media doing their job. The media's job is not to be the PR agency for the nuclear industry or anybody else. The media's job, even at the level of the BBC, which has a slightly different remit because it has got a national sort of pedigree, but the media's job is to sell papers or to get clicks. So whenever you see something on, on a local newspaper site that's shared on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, one of those idiotic headlines about someone who's found the face of a celebrity in a piece of toast or something stupid, they're not saying this is the most critical thing that's happened today. Their job is to get people to engage in it. And if I go on there and type, this is a waste of time and it's not real news, that's still a success for them because I've engaged on it. And they get measured by the number of clicks and comments they get. They will get more clicks and comments if they call it a waste of, including from people like me going, you shouldn't call it a waste of. But we have to recognize that's them doing their job. It's not up to them to make an open, transparent, balanced case for why nuclear waste disposal is a good thing and what the impact might be in a certain community. The industry and the local community and others need to do that. So I don't hold them in high regard for doing it, but we need to recognize that's them doing their job.
Really congratulate ourselves on making that
That's a great question, Jackie. For anyone who didn't catch it, it's is it down to the industry that we're doing better, or is it just other people doing more badly? I think it's a bit of both. I think the industry is better. There's a point where keeping nuclear out of the news is good for the industry, because if people are picking on and highlighting minor glitches, a sock that falls the wrong side of a barrier in a change room or something, but gets reported to the regulator because it should, there was a time when those things would find their way into papers. There's been less of that, and perhaps the media being more responsible in that respect. But I've been at energy debates where, over the last 10 years or so, where nuclear gets mentioned and nobody flinches, and it's when people talk about fracking that the eggs and the tomatoes get thrown and people start standing up and shouting from the back, because some of those other technologies have been doing less well. That's partly because of, I think the fracking companies did particularly badly in community engagement with the communities where they pitched up to drill, but also the recognition about the impact of fossil fuels on the planet. And we're seeing some of that at the moment. We're still seeing stop oil and stop gas campaigners in and around the country. But we're also seeing, world events like the threat to European gas supplies also helping to make the case for nuclear more strongly for geopolitical and energy security reasons. So I don't think the industry can claim all the credit, but I do think they're doing better than they used to do. Certainly doing better than they used to do at the time of that atomic milk film. Great. Well, thank you for the questions and the comments. I'm happy. I'll put my email address on the last slide, and we'll get the slide shared afterwards. But if anybody does have comments or questions or anything they would like to share afterwards, then please do so. What we're going to do now is I'll just introduce it first, and I think somebody who's probably Anika, who's somebody who's good with the technology, is going to put those online into some breakout groups for the exercise. We're going to run a crisis communications exercise. So let me remove the. Yeah, let's stop the recording now because it would be hard. Well, first of all, I don't want to give this